Hi friends, my name's Host Eric. I'm the host of Talking with Famous People. Yesterday I made a video about an article published in Psychology Today by Monica Verani, and the title of which is about older people, the general gist of which is about older people and the impacts of marijuana, potentially negative impacts of marijuana on them. So what was surprising to me, I was in kind of a scoldy mood yesterday, was later on when I was live streaming, she showed up and she said, "What is your PhD in?" And that made me mad. And then I didn't really engage with her in a productive fashion. And so I want to apologize for not engaging with her in a productive fashion. And I want to present the following quote from Monica to Monica. "The reality is that knowledge is power, and with it we can change course and make healthier choices. There's no time like the present to break free of harmful patterns and create a healthier and happier future." So, since she is interested in my qualifications, I don't have any doctorate. I am, by trade, or was a professional debate coach for many years, and a very good one. So my expertise is in being correct, not in anything else. And, of course, being correct doesn't require anybody else's validation of you as somebody who's an expert in being correct. It just requires you to actually be an expert in being correct. So let's go ahead and look at what this involves. The title of this video is Actualization, Wellness, and Pathologization. Although it's probably like Monica Verani, Psychology Today follow-up or something is the title. But regardless, let's look at what we're seeing here. First, we need to understand, she needs to understand, and anybody who wants to give advice to anybody in any capacity needs to understand the role of a psychologist or an advisor. Number one is to understand the person. That means believing reported subjective data. Like I've got a neighbor, Les, who is disabled and has pain because of an old injury, and he actually drinks scotch and says that that's the best painkiller for it. I certainly couldn't do that. It sounds insane to me, but I believe his subjective reported data. He has no reason to lie, and I understand that some people are very different from other people. Drugs affect people very differently. Next, you need to understand the risks of giving advice. There's a tendency to project, and there's also a tendency to prefer universalization so that you don't have to, so that there's no need to actually get all the work in and it's required to understand a person, right? If you're engaged in the tendency to project, then you're just saying, look, my experience is negative with this thing, so this thing is negative. Like my experience with alcohol is very negative, but I don't universalize and say other people shouldn't drink. I have no opinion about what other people should do with consuming things, right? And nobody really should. The tendency to prefer universalization, like I said, is simply the reality that in many cases it's a situational thing where it depends on the situation as to whether it's good for grandma to smoke pot or whether she wants. But number one question is whether or not grandma wants to. Understand what's required. It's required then for anybody giving advice to take into account the fact that there are different kinds of data. So if somebody tells you certain kinds of things are happening to them, you might objectively say that's abuse, or you might objectively tell somebody they're abusing another. And that's fine, regardless of their subjective data, because we have some pretty clear, bright lines when it comes to what qualifies as toxic or unhealthy. And one of those is certainly ontological diminishment, ontological assault, etc. So there's also an important I should put this in the risks, but to make sure you keep in mind unintended consequences. You don't know what your advocacy's consequences are going to be for the various parties involved unless you're very clear on understanding that person first. Okay, so we'll go into more about unintended consequences as we go through these critiques. So I did these critiques in a debate style. In other words, violation, standard, alternative, impact. So the first violation I have for her article is ontological negation, which is to say she's telling a large group of people that there's something wrong with them. The standard here is wellness and harm prevention. That's her standard I'm using. We're using her standard for essentially the value to uphold in all the critiques. And the alternative is individuation. She needs to recognize that if she's going to put an article up reporting on these these side effects and stuff, that she needs to put some disclaimers in there. Different people react to different drugs very differently. Those kind of disclaimers. Okay, so the alternative, I did that. The impact, harms. So let's look here what this is. The harms linked to temporal bargaining. For many people, they have relationships with certain substances or behaviors that qualify as temporal bargaining arrangements. And so I want to read this article. I couldn't get the full citation for it, but the book's called Surrounding Self-Control. I would have had to work hard to get it. Surrounding Self-Control, edited by Alfred R. Mealy. And this part here is about Frankfurt and his understanding of temporal bargaining, but is a good description of how we ought to think about drug addiction. Frankfurt illustrates his picture of freedom of the will with the discussion of addiction. Someone who lacks second-order volitions entirely and acts only according to his first-order desires is a wanton, which is to say a creature for which the question of free will simply doesn't arise. This creature does not have a will that is free or unfree, it just acts. In contrast, a drug addict with a very strong second-order desire not to want to take the drug, but who nevertheless takes it, has a second-order volition, but is unable to secure its conformity with his first-order volition, and therefore lacks freedom of will. Another drug addict who does not resist, but rather wants to take his drug of choice, acts freely and from a free will because he acts out of a will that is aligned with his second-order desires. Frankfurt thus frames personhood relative to the wanton. While the question of free will does not arise for wantons, persons are agents for which free will is potentially an issue. And so what we see here is, in explaining the mechanism of that, which is basically saying you have to evaluate people and their relationship with their will, not their specific behaviors that you might identify, such as that guy smokes pot. So Rachel H., Teleological Science of Self-Control, Behavioral and Brain Sciences, 1997, says, the value of a temporally extended behavioral pattern depends on relationships inherent in the pattern itself. It is not possible to express that value as the simple sum of the discounted present values of the pattern's component acts. In other words, you cannot express to me that I'd be better off without smoking pot, because you can't just leave everything else in there and have it be the same and then remove smoking pot. There's lots of stuff that's contingent on those temporal bargaining relationships, right? Or just relationships in general with your own will and what you want to do, what you think you should do, and what you will do. So 3, this is really a matter of agency and rights, and it's important for Monica to understand that her attempt at harm prevention is really an exercise in pathologization, and it's doing more harm to the population of people, namely older people who smoke pot, than she thinks, because she's imagining a world where they can simply remove pot and it doesn't have any impact on anything else. It's not part of any system, right? But that's wrong. So, explanation. We see that psychology has pathologized lots of things so much all over the years, and ridiculously so. Homosexuality used to be pathologized. It was a mental illness. Screen time has been pathologized. Weight and diet. We see these crazy Ozempic people who think it's desperately important for them their body to be a certain size. And then you have awful people who don't understand that the temporal bargaining stuff and the complex relationship of an individual to his or her will. They're telling people that they ought to be ashamed of their body, or they ought to behave differently regarding what they eat in their body because it's unhealthy for them to be fat or something. That is it's the worst kind of ignorance. Awkwardness has been pathologized as some sort of autism spectrum thing. Follow through has been pathologized as an executive function disorder. Activity level has been pathologized as ADHD. Compliance has been pathologized as ODD. There have been plenty of politically motivated pathologizations. What's wrong with people who vote for Meow? And then, of course, all your vices have been pathologized. But that's, at least there, you have this distinction between having a problem with something. In other words, it's your second order volition is not getting its way. Your first order volition has become do drugs or have sex or whatever. So people get treated for addiction and lots of things. But addiction is not inherently itself bad, right? So, as we saw in the first thing, as long as you understand yourself, or relatively well actualized like I am, and you have, you by the time you're 54 years old like me, you have a huge mountain of frameworks of stories and stuff that you understand your self-concept through. So, and you understand your experience through. So for me, smoking pot is more of an experiential management, right? Sometimes I feel like getting a little faded, and that helps structure my day. Oh, well, then after I pull these bowls, I'll do that, or whatever, you know? Now, critique 2, bad app. This is just simply, she's done a poor job of researching and reasoning. The violation is she has a clear agenda against pot or drugs in general. The standard is she should take a disinterested perspective, at least enough to do the research right. 10, the alternative is intellectual honesty. If we look at 2025, this Danish study, this study took place over more than 30 years. The final study, this was just on men, so it doesn't prove anything regarding women, but the final study group included 5,162 men. These men were born between 49 and 61. Their initial intelligence tests were conducted between 67 and 89 when they were around 20 years old on average. The follow-up exams took place between 2015 and 2022 when the men were around 64 years old on average. On average, the men in the study experienced a cognitive decline of about 6 points over the 44-year period. Interestingly, men who used cannabis at some point in their lives actually showed slightly less cognitive decline compared to men who had never used cannabis. This finding held even after considering other factors like age, education, lifestyle, and health. When the researchers looked at different aspects of cannabis use among users, such as the age they were when they started using cannabis or how many years they used it frequently, they did not find any significant link to cognitive decline. Whether someone started using cannabis before age 18, between 18 and 25, or after 25, did not seem to affect their cognitive decline in late middle age. Similarly, the number of years of frequent cannabis use was not related to a greater or lesser degree of cognitive decline. Now, if we look at her paper, of course, in her early paragraph, which isn't even about old people, she says, the lion's share of research on the impacts of cannabis usage has focused on teens and young adults. As a result, the harmful impacts of habitual and heavy cannabis use on developing brains are increasingly acknowledged and understood, as are the impacts of cannabis usage on young adults on functional memory and the negative physical and mental effects of cannabis use, including impaired cognitive functioning. Except the actual most recent data, the most powerful data we could possibly look at, which is a 30-plus year study that includes marking intelligence at the beginning of this and checking against it when they're old and stuff, right? This is complete nonsense. You're wrong. You didn't do the research. The impact of this, of course, it harms the author's credibility. I don't think anybody should use her services as a clinical psychologist. It's the mechanism leading to the self-concept harms. When you're ontologically assaulting other people and telling them there's something wrong with you, and you're feeding into people's implicit doubts, unless you're pretty well actualized, which I'd like to believe I am at this point, although that's a fairly recent phenomenon. I had to go through a lot of processing after my dad and mom's death and stuff. But unless you're pretty well actualized like me, you're susceptible to doubting yourself. But it's not just actualization. It's about where you access which kind of data. For me, I have access to my subjective data, and I understand its role, and I don't try to overuse it because how I pay attention, right? And I have maybe not very much access to my emotional subjective data, but I do to my physical subjective data. And where am I going with this? Oh, so it's like I'm capable of understanding who I am. Rachel, on the other hand, who has subjective data, not very conscious at all in both areas, both emotionally and physically, she's much more likely to trust an external source regarding herself, even when she shouldn't, because that external source is full of poo. So, explanation. This is my brain on drugs. It's also my brain when I'm not on drugs. There's nothing wrong with you and there's nothing wrong with me. But Monica, there is something wrong with your paper. Don't side with evil in your quest to do good. I get that you believe you're doing harm prevention, helping these old people who you imagine as helpless and needing your guidance. Don't be presumptuous, okay? And get your head out of your drug warrior butt, frankly. Critique 3, it's just bad medicine. She talk to your doctor about alternative pain management. Except marijuana is the alternative pain management. Marijuana is the safest alternative by far. It has the lowest toxicity of basically anything. And other drugs that you take to manage pain tend to be actually addictive, unlike marijuana, as measured by producing withdrawal symptoms. Then she also talks about CBD oil versus other forms of marijuana. CBD oil is not something that is even, it doesn't even get you high at all. So, I mean, the thing that CBD oil causes drowsiness, I mean, good luck with that. Good luck with that. And then these extremely rare things like CUD and cyclic vomiting syndrome, those aren't reasons to not eat, to not smoke pot any more than, say, the fact that peanut allergies exist is a reason for you not to eat peanuts. Those things are essentially acquired allergies that are very, very rare. At least the second one is. I've never even heard of the first one, cannabis use disorder. I could have Googled it. I didn't. Sue me. Anyway, so I hope this calm explication of things, I hope Monica actually watches it and listens to what I say, the words specifically, and not frame it as some kind of thing that's easily dismissed. When she left the chat, she left by saying to me that I'm a drug addict. But I just smoke pot regularly and take drugs that I'm prescribed. And most importantly, I'm being the person I want to be and living the life I want to live. People who advise me to change my behaviors without knowing anything about me are very, very presumptuous and need a stern talking to. And this is what this is for Monica, a stern talking to, but a nice stern talking to. Hopefully you'll retract that paper, make a video yourself saying, you know what, this guy's absolutely right. I need to look into this more, because that's the only solution for this problem for you. Thanks a lot. See you later. Love you, everybody. And don't forget to eat plenty of cheese.